Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. So I just watched Lovecraft Country episode 4. Let's talk about it. So yet again, I find myself reviewing this show in the middle of the night. Again, week after week, I always do this. I need to stop. I'm trying not to wake anyone else up in the house, so that's why I'm speaking a little bit quieter than usual. But this episode, thankfully, wasn't quite as scary and horror-filled as some of the other episodes have been, so I'm feeling pretty okay right now. Still recovering from last week, though. Instead, what this show gave us a little bit more of was this sense of adventure through this national treasure and Indiana Jones storyline. So here we have the main trio, Tick, Letty and Tick's father Montrose, going on this journey to find the pages, the missing pages that we found out about in the previous episode when Christina, I remembered her name for this week. I finally remembered her name after watching this episode. Previously I had been referring to her as the daughter, so at least I'm progressing there. But Christina had dropped the little hints to Tick, telling him that there were missing pages from the Book of Adam, and that if these pages were to be found, they would be able to translate the language of Adam and therefore cast these powerful spells. Now, when it comes to this storyline in general, like I already expressed in my review of last week's episode, I'm not the biggest fan when it comes to the mysticism aspects of this show. I know that is kind of the brunt of what the show is about. Like, this is a Lovecraftian story. It is based off of his works, and so of course I should be expecting some horror elements, some mystical elements. But I personally am not the most drawn to that genre. What I was drawn to was the kind of enveloping of that genre with actual social justice issues, which is what I'm most fascinated by when it comes to this series, and what it usually does so well is kind of bringing those two aspects together to form something that is completely unique. But in this episode, I will say there was a little less emphasis on this kind of commentary. Instead, it chose to focus mostly on the main storyline and kind of propelling the story forward for the rest of the season, which I can completely appreciate, considering they have a lot of work to do, especially considering this is what, an 8-episode season, or I believe 10 episodes at the most, so they have a lot of ground to cover. But anyways, I digress. So Christina let Tick know that these pages were out there and they had something to do with Letty's new house and something to do with a lot of the mysteries that are surrounding this town in North Chicago. So all of the clues that they're able to gather lead them to this museum in Boston, under which they find themselves in this huge cavern with all of these booby traps. So this ended up being the place where Titus had hidden those pages, and they ended up having to go through this whole obstacle course to get to them. I will say though, in terms of creating this whole Indiana Jones-esque adventure, it was quite short-lived. They kind of rushed through a lot of the problem-solving aspects of an adventure like this. I think it was, of course, because of the constraints of timing. You have one episode, you're trying to wrap things up as well as preparing the story forward, but at the same time I do think that the kind of adventure aspects suffered for it, because they seem to be able to solve a lot of these issues very quickly, especially with Montrose's information that he had gathered from that book that Uncle George had managed to give him before he died. They managed to get through the tunnels, the obstacle courses, just the madness that Titus had left behind, just to ensure that no one would get a hold of those pages. And actually we see that the tunnel that they take leads them to the tunnel that we see at the end of the previous episode, where Letty's dead white neighbors ended up, after they were trying to ransack her house, it was in the sub-level of her house. It was that very creepy sequence at the end there where we saw that there was this whole tunnel that looked almost like a crypt when we first saw it, but actually it turns out that it is connected to this Boston museum through a series of tunnels, a whole network. And it makes sense now why Christina would want Letty to even live in this house, because apparently it had a direct line to Titus's pages. Speaking of Christina, I wholeheartedly believe that she is doing all of this on purpose. She let Tick know about those pages because she wanted him and the gang, to do all of the hard work for her, because at the end of the day it'd be so much easier to get those pages that she needs from Tick as opposed to Titus, who has this booby trapped whole situation. So she just thought, if I tell him about those pages and I tell him about how important they are, it will trigger this manly urge to go explore and to be the one, the chosen one in his storyline, and therefore he will lead me straight to them. He will do all of the heavy lifting. Meanwhile, I'll just be able to snatch those pages right out of his hands after he's done all of that. This is a classic case of a female character character that's exhibiting brains over brawn. We kind of see an aspect to this character trait in Letty as well, but Letty to me takes it a step further. She's not just someone who's, brains over brawn. She's someone that gets things done. I very much appreciate that about her. In all of these mini adventures that they've gone on so far, Letty has propelled them forward. Tick at times sometimes can get into his own head. He can kind of read into things too much, and in moments where snap decisions need to be made, he's just not able to make them as quickly as Letty is, but she is very decisive. And we see this especially in this episode where Tick is very much exuding that, chosen one aura, and it gets kind of frustrating because it's like, okay, we've seen this time and time again. But then the show subverts that expectation that we have in terms of, focusing solely on Tick because he is the chosen one, he's the descendant of Titus. Letty is the one to tell him, look, you might be the descendant of this Titus guy, but let's not forget what everyone else has been through. I was killed, like she was literally dead and brought back, and then Uncle George, unfortunately his fate was far, far worse than hers because he wasn't brought back. So much has happened since then as well. So the fact that Tick is kind of taking on this ownership of this entire story and not realizing that the people around him have been equally affected is kind of selfish of him, and I love the fact that she called him out on it. And the fact that she was able to do so was also having like water up to her chin as the tide was coming in was very, very impressive. So after Tick is able to finally be of use and use his actual blood to open the doors to the, I guess, crypt that they find themselves in somehow. I don't even understand the geography of how all of that works, but anyway, they find themselves in this kind of crypt. I don't even know what you would call that, but there are all of these dead bodies that seem to be organized as though they're in a banquet. It is super creepy. Like, those are the horror elements of the show kind of seeping through here at the last minute, but it was a very creepy scene, and it also resonated quite deeply, especially in light of what was discussed earlier on in the museum, because during their museum visit, whilst they were scouting out their place, they ended up at Titus's exhibit. The museum experts were talking about how Titus was this great explorer who went around and discovered all of these incredible tropical lands and brought civilization to all of these savages and these savage and primitive civilizations. And this is the kind of rhetoric that you see time and time again surrounding a lot of the early colonizers, a lot of the kind of colonialism that is romanticized as these explorers who were just going out there trying to explore. And this entire narrative completely ignores and completely negates the violence, the exploitation, the suffering and upheaval that these explorers, colonizers, brought to these native lands. And that perfectly ties in with the name of the episode itself, which is A History of Violence, kind of connoting the history of violence associated with the early colonization of these native peoples, as we see once again at the very end there, where we see that banquet of the dead. It's so eerie, it's so haunting. And actually we also get a hint of the main theme of this episode at the beginning, when Montrose is mourning the loss of his brother, and as he burns that rule book from the Sons of Adam, he's reminded of the smell of Tulsa, and that of course refers to the Tulsa massacre that occurred in, I believe, 1921, which was greatly referenced in last year's Watchmen. But back to the banquet of the dead, we see that someone who seemed to have been a leader of this tribe, a leader of these peoples, they are able to reanimate as soon as Tick reaches for those papers, and they seem to be the pages that they're looking for. So of course they're thinking, oh great, this is creepy, but our job is done, we can go now. But no, they're not done yet, because they reanimate in this really creepy, terrifying way, and it turns out that this person is intersex, and I believe they refer to it as two spirits, which is something that I have absolutely no knowledge of, so I won't speak on it too much. But I hesitate to say that I don't think it was the best representation of an intersex person or someone who exhibits intersex characteristics, especially considering what happened at the very end of the episode where they were killed brutally. But before we get to that plot twist, we do see another example of Titus's exploitation of native peoples in the form of the members of the death banquet, or the banquet of death, I believe I've been calling it. And their leader, once they are reanimated, explains that they had been forced to translate the papers, and once they refused to translate it for Titus, he threatened to kill all of their people. And as a result, they ended up being cursed to watch their people die, whilst at the same time never dying and never truly finding piece themselves. So I thought this was a very clever commentary on the exploitation of colonialism, and also this narrative that surrounds it of these people being explorers and just trying to, see the world and bring civilization to the rest of the world, as well as, Christianity, religious customs. That was very much a narrative that was spread, especially in the early 20th century, which is interesting because this episode takes a lot of its cues from films like Indiana Jones, and people have kind of commented on this over the years, saying that this is a very outdated look on exploration and discovery because it ignores the factors like exploitation. It romanticizes the entire process whilst also completely ignoring the perspectives of the native people. So then we get to the very end of the episode with this huge plot twist where Montrose ends up slitting Yahima's throat, and it is crazy. At first I assumed that Montrose wasn't who everyone thought he was. I thought he was possessed by, I don't know, the spirit of Titus or something. Like, why else would he do that? But then I started thinking, well, maybe the beginning of the episode gives us a few clues as to why he would do that, because we already see the precedent be set when he sets the book that Uncle George gave him on fire. He's already made it very clear that he does not want his son to get involved in these, mystical and magical elements. He doesn't want him to be anywhere near this stuff because he's afraid for him. And the whole episode, you see just how deep Montrose's fear runs within him, and you can see that for all different aspects of his life. You see his sexuality often being brought into question by others, which of course would bring about so much fear within him, especially during this time as a man, as a black man. But then you also see, the fact that this magical stuff has come into his son's life. It terrifies him, and throughout the entire episode, yes, he's able to kind of help them in terms of giving them knowledge, but as soon as he has the opportunity to kill the only person who could potentially translate the language of Adam, he takes that opportunity immediately. He sees this as an opportunity to keep his son away from all of this magic, whilst at the same time presenting a disadvantage for the sons of Adam because they no longer have someone that could help them translate those pages. Aside from this whole adventure, we do get a few BC plot lines in this episode as well. First of all, let's talk about Ruby. Ruby's storyline was so heartbreaking for me because this is a character who had her heart set on working in that department store. Now, that might seem very trivial today because, jobs at department stores or retail jobs in general are just so easy to come by. I mean, maybe not right now because of corona, but just in general at this time, it's such a different environment for people of color. You can get a job working in retail much more easily in comparison to back then. But back then it was such a huge deal because these companies were looking at the people on the storefront as representations of them, as an extension of that company. And so to have a black woman representing them in this very racist society, it was very problematic indeed. But the fact that we see Ruby in the store itself, ready to make her application, ready to submit her interest for this role, but then she sees that black employee and her face just falls because she realizes there's no way. If there's already one, there's no way there'll be two. Like, that's just the kind of society that there is. And there's many jobs out there today that are the very same, by the way. But it was something that was way worse during that time, and she immediately realized that her chances of being hired were slim to none. And that just, it was so sad. And then to add insult to injury, that black employee even said like she just applied on a whim. Like, she wasn't as burdened by all of this second guessing that Ruby had because she'd been trying out for this job for so long, but she wasn't as burdened by all of that rejection and all of that fear. I guess a lot of this episode explored, different kinds of fear, but a lot of that fear that Ruby had stopped her from, putting her name forward for the role, and this black woman just didn't have that burden to bear. So then Ruby ends up in a bar and she's singing, but her heart's not in it, and she's drunk. She gets herself another drink, except she says that she can't afford it, and then lo and behold, who do we see? We see William. We see William there. Now, earlier on in this episode, William said that he had a date. I guess this was the date that he had been planning for, and clearly this is something that has something to do with Christina's plan. William is 100% trying to get closer to Ruby because one, Ruby lives in that goddamn house with her sister, and two, because Ruby is close to the gang, being Letty's sister, so she's definitely going to be giving him an in in terms of getting closer to the gang so that he can get those pages for Christina. I 100% believe that's what's going on. I don't believe that William all of a sudden developed an interest in her, especially because he lies to her and he acts like he doesn't know who Letty is. So that's already a sign. But what I will say I will say, you know, we do have a sex scene that proceeds with these two characters. And I will say it was really nice to see the representation of a black woman who is plus size in a sex scene. That's something that we don't often see. We don't even see it in shows like Insecure, which has a black character who's like obsessed with sex in that show in the form of Kelly. But we never actually see her engage in it. So this is really cool in terms of having representation like that. Although I don't think this is a genuine relationship that will last, because William is a con artist. He's working for Christina. He's a liar. He cannot be trusted. Let's talk about what Christina herself was up to this episode. Now, she is trying to gain access to the Sons of Adam. She wants to be a part of this organization, or at least have the same amount of power that they do. Because she's disadvantaged as a woman, she feels like she's constantly treated as inferior as a result. I understand Christina's plight. I understand, you know, what she's fighting for and why she's doing what she's doing. My problem is I don't care. I don't care. When it comes to Christina's whole gig, how can I reasonably feel sorry for her, feel anything for her, because she's a woman, when she's rich and privileged and white and just like, and also she's not fighting for anything that's of value. Like, she's literally just fighting so that she can cast spells. Like, am I supposed to root for that? That she's fighting so that she can be a part of this racist cult? Like, what am I supposed to be following here? I don't understand what the show wants me to feel when it comes to Christina, because they keep giving us, you know, hints as to, you know, how she feels disenfranchised because of the fact that she's a woman, even though she's in a very powerful family. But it's like, yeah, but you're in a very powerful family, you have a nice car, you have great, you know, houses, you have great outfits. Like, what do you want me to feel bad for? Especially in a show that highlights the plight of black people, like the plight of indigenous people, the plight of so many others who suffer during this time. What do you want me to feel towards Christina? I'm confused. I completely understand that she's the villain, and so you're not supposed to really root for her or anything, but they're trying to create a little bit of nuance there where I don't think there is nuance to be found. Basically. And finally, before we leave things off, I did want to mention that cute little day trip that Hippolyta had with her daughter at the museum, where Hippolyta mentioned that she was the one that named the constellation, because there was this whole competition, but they didn't acknowledge her because she was a black girl. And I found it so adorable that her daughter wanted to promote her mother's success and promote her mother's achievements, and so she told everyone in the museum exhibit there with them that she was the one that named the constellation. That was really adorable. And I also very much like how this show has exemplified this incredibly intelligent black woman in the form of Hippolyta. I think it's great to have this kind of representation, because yes, whilst it's great to have Letty, who's feisty, who's powerful, who gets things done, it's also great to have a calmer and more pensive and intelligent female black character on the show to kind of balance out all of these different personalities and represent the huge spectrum of personalities that exist within the black female community. And we see at the very end in the episode that Hippolyta's role will most likely be getting even bigger as opposed to smaller, when she kind of turns the car around in this dramatic U-turn and goes back to find answers about what happened to her husband. So that's it from me. Now that I told you guys my thoughts on episode 4 of Lovecraft Country, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of this episode down in the comments below. Please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.